Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered, the go-to podcast for anything and everything retail crime related. I'm your host, Professor Emmeline Taylor. Now, unless you've been living under a rock in the UK, you will have seen that there's been a huge amount of coverage in the media about shop theft and crime more generally in the retail sector. And on the one hand, this is brilliant. It highlights the issues and really just how bad things have actually got. But I've also been slightly concerned because many of these stories attribute the rise in crime and particularly theft from shops as being a direct result of the cost of living crisis. And I've been surprised by this because it doesn't tally with what I've been hearing from retailers, from the police, and even from offenders themselves that have been sharing their motivations. And so I worry about the presumption that this is simply the cost of living crisis, and as we have an economic uplift, simply crime will disappear. But it also criminalises the poor, and I'm not okay with that, the presumption that if somebody's in poverty, they simply become a criminal overnight. It's far too simplistic. We've probably all watched enough crime dramas as well to know that the obvious answer is often the incorrect one. So I thought I'd go and speak to a range of supermarket employees to better understand from the front line what they're seeing in and around their stores. And I asked them, is this really just about the cost of living crisis?
Smoke and mirrors. This is nothing to do with the cost of living. So I suppose when media pick it up and they see baby milk being stolen, for instance, they say the mums or parents can't afford to feed their babies. That's not the reality. The reality is that's sold, it's used to cut drugs, or it's shipped to other European countries. This is nothing to do with the cost of living. The only effect of the cost of living that I see is the market's broadened for stolen goods. So I think there's elements of the community on certain salaries that maybe 12, 24 months ago wouldn't have entertained someone knocking on the door with a steak or cheese. I think now there's an increase in people that see it as attractive because they can't afford certain food groups, and that market's probably broadened, so that might be an element of why things are increasing. I'd imagine they've got a broader market to sell to now than they did due to the cost of living. Past that, I genuinely don't think there's an impact.
I found the comments about smoke and mirrors really intriguing. The idea that criminals are hiding behind the cost of living crisis and creating a facade to divert attention away from their illicit behaviours and essentially blame another cohort in society. Now, of course, some individuals might be stealing on occasion some items because their budgets no longer stretch as far as they used to. I'm not completely denying that, but it would seem that what's been described as a shoplifting epidemic across the UK is not fundamentally being driven by the cost of living crisis. So what is happening?
I wouldn't class it as shoplifting, I would class it as looting in some cases. We've got so many stores that have the same group of people that come in several times a day, every week, every month. And yeah, it's the morale is so rock bottom now in these stores because they feel like the support from the police is not where it needs to be.
You've got those repeat offenders, you know exactly their names, you know exactly what they look like, you know exactly where they're going, who they're working for as well. There's a lot of intel you can get from these people because they're quite open and honest about it. I have some conversations with them sometimes. I'm like, where are you going with all this? And they tell me exactly where they're going. So there's one particular offender who, I'm sure we can all relate to this. He was every single day, 3-4 times a day, sometimes more in your case. And it took a year for this particular person to get arrested, even though the police knew who he was, where he was, because he was offending all over Portsmouth, not just Co-op,
right.
All over the town, everywhere. The town centre was getting hit completely every day by him. So it got to the point where it was literally every day. It was taking I've lost count, probably hundreds of reports for this one person just to get him arrested. So I think that's the main struggle, is you're managing crime. We're still managers, but we're crime managers as well.
And so obviously that was a very prolific offender, just as one example of what's happening. What do you think was their motivation? What
Drugs.
were they? So it was drugs.
The main issue is there's not drug rehab. There's not good enough drug rehab.
You also mentioned something really interesting, who they're working for.
Yeah.
So it's organised crime.
It's organised. So for example, we've got a big tower block next to our shop. We know that there's someone in there that she's got a council flat and she lets them live with her, and their rent is stock. Our stock is their rent, so they've got a roof over their head. She then distributes it over, around the estate, sells it to make money. It makes sense because she's always leading them to us and then taking them back up. There's these sort of bases where they all go, and we know who these people are. We know their names.
I heard similar stories to this up and down the country, whereby criminal enterprises had been set up to shift goods that were being stolen in bulk by drug addicts. But despite hearing the tales repeated, I was still astounded by just how blatant some of these setups were. I'm probably more astounded how nothing was seemingly being done about it. If you listen closely enough, you can probably hear my jaw hit the floor in this next story.
We have a local pub across the road, which they take our stock to, and then the pub sells it off. They have like a little stall in the pub that they sell. We've actually, our staff's been banned from the pub. Inside. We're not welcome there.
So co-op staff are banned from this pub?
Yeah. But the staff are still allowed to shop in our shop. We have to serve people in the uniform all the time. Yeah. But
right, because they don't want you to see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when you say they've got a little stall, what do you mean? What does that look like?
So I have a friend who lives in the local area, and he recently went to the pub because he didn't know all the backstory of this. He just thought it was like the local pub in the area, and he said they had a table with all of our stock on it, and they were presenting it like trophies in a sense.
Yeah, there's also one of in our next town, which is bad to where I live. There's a lady that has a Facebook page, and the shoplifters will go to her house, take the stock, and she puts all the stock on her Facebook page and says, "I've got this meat for £10 pack." Co-op, Tesco, Usdaw, wherever the shoplifters have been, whether it's meat, whether it's chocolates, coffee, and she's brazen enough to just put it on their Facebook page on the community site. The shoplifters drop it off at the back door, and 10 minutes later it's going out the front door.
I think that just says enough about like what's being done, because that information is not just being put.
It's on the website.
When I originally worked back in shop in Cleethorpes, they had a car park across the road from the shop, and our main shoplifter there used to literally bring a fold-up table and sell it in the car park across the road. And they did like at least hourly police like patrols through the road, and they just did nothing about it. The police more attacked us as staff members, being like, you should try harder to stop it yourself.
It became incredibly clear that in a large proportion of incidents that involve prolific shoplifters, that the store owners and managers had a very good idea of exactly where those stolen items were ending up. And sadly, many cited other businesses, cafes, pubs, other stores, in what sounded almost like a cannibalistic or sort of parasitic, perhaps that's the right word, system where some businesses were fueling crime being committed against others, and often ones that were in the same community or even businesses that were located on the same street. And there was also cases of individuals who would sell using online marketplaces or directly to the community, often recruiting drug addicts to steal for them, and the stock essentially becoming their payment for a bed for the night or somewhere safe and warm that they could use to take drugs. And I want to bring in the concepts of criminal exploitation and modern day slavery here. I think we all agree that prolific drug-affected offenders need to be apprehended, and they need to have appropriate, meaningful sanctions that address the root causes of their offending behaviour. They need rehabilitation. But we also need to focus attention on those that are profiting from their addiction. And I don't just mean the drug dealers, I mean those that are exploiting drug addicts due to their vulnerability and their desperation for their own criminal gains. But it's not limited to just drug addicts either. There were so many examples that I was told about relating to vulnerable young people being exploited by adults who saw them as disposable or relatively risk-free due to the age of criminal responsibility, or that they were easily manipulated and coerced into stealing. And in return, they might be given fancy trainers, drugs, cash, or sometimes even just the pretense of friendship and care in return. Then when the young person or the vulnerable adult is apprehended, the criminal who's essentially pulling the strings simply steps away, leaves them to face arrest and potential prosecution on their own.
There's been a couple of changes in law in Scotland over the last 2-3 years in relation to the legal age of criminal consent was increased from 8 to 12. Now, businesses when engage with, or consider, throughout that process, it was just put forward and passed with it was really known. Where that impacts us is more around the sort of school age kids, the great criminals of the future. It's really, really key, obviously, that, we focus on them and keep them away from the crime path. But it makes them more vulnerable for the adults or organised crime groups then to use them either for shoplifting or other crimes because they can't be held to account. There's no consequence to it.
And so are you seeing that? Are you seeing gangs recruit young people to steal on their behalf?
We are, and not just within the co-op, but other retailers and other businesses that we obviously engage and collaborate with, including Retailers Against Crime, ScotMid, other convenience, Scottish Grocers Federation. They're reporting it back as well at our discussions and our meetings, that they're seeing more and more.
I was really interested in this factor that young people might be being exploited by adults and explored it further in other locations. The age of criminal responsibility is 10 years old in England and Wales. So in these following examples, it appears less to be about them not being prosecuted, but just a complete indifference as to what actually happens to them.
So you can see at the front of my shop, I've got massive front windows, and you can often see the kids handing over things to adults.
Right.
And I would say that's for drugs.
Okay.
And then the drug runners as well.
In schools as well, don't they?
Yeah, we haven't taken whole cases off the shelf of just normal chocolate bars, but yeah, a lot of them I would say are drug runners as well.
Right.
You can see, I'm not profiling people, but you can see that they're running drugs for these people as well, and they're doing what they're told.
It's really clear to see that the picture of offending is not straightforward, and there's a whole range of different issues that seem to be driving the current epidemic in theft. But I think it's really important to include phenomena such as exploitation and modern day slavery in some of these conversations about offenders. Otherwise, you do just end up with smoke and mirrors, as we talked about earlier. So let's turn now to think about the actual impact that this is having on shop workers.
One main concern we have in the store where we have till robberies, where the colleague there's a locked door behind a till, and then the three males go behind a till with a colleague being stuck behind a till. So luckily so far nobody being physically hurt, but the colleague, the impact on mental health she had, I think she would rather suffer 1 or 2 bruises than being mentally stressed every day, because the effect it has on her where she's stuck behind a till, she can't climb out because there's protective screens, she doesn't know what could happen, she got body cam on her chest, the shoplifters covering her, stopping her from filming, so I think the mental impact is more hurtful than a physical one. Seeing, watching, going through this, and it's happening over and over and again. And despite saying to colleague, look, they're not there to hurt you from past experiences, they're coming in, they're taking stock and they're leaving. But it's easy to say, it's fine, it's not going to happen again, but it's happening over and over and again, and same colleagues are leaving through this again and again, and you can see the pattern where the colleagues on the first occasion going off sick or feeling like they need to go home to rethink what's happened. Second time they go into canteen, they settle in, they have a cup of tea, they rethink what's happened. The third time they just dealing with it in a manner where, right, that's a normal day-to-day job. But end of the day, the colleagues are feeling like they have to come to work. They don't like to come, but they have to because they have to feed families, or until they find a better job or a safer job.
I was really struck by this description of normalisation and essentially how the shop worker has adjusted her threshold of what is acceptable workplace experiences. But it's a description that I heard over and over again, and that was really concerning. We know that retail is a lot of people's first job. We also know that there's a lot of female in the workforce. And looking at the broader picture of violence towards women and girls, I really worry about this normalisation and what that could potentially do to expectations around safety, well-being, and about how to be treated, and of course, mental health. Back in 2019, as part of the Co-op's Safer Colleagues, Safer Communities campaign, I worked on the report It's Not Part of the Job, and it detailed the devastating consequences of shop workers being subjected to violence, aggression and prolonged verbal abuse. And in that report, I documented the cases of anxiety and even post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that many shop workers were experiencing as a direct result of serving their communities. And now, sadly, 4 or 5 years on, it actually seems like things have got a whole lot worse.
Punching, kicking, people getting dragged around the shop floor by the hair, people who's run outside after a shoplifter that have then been kicked all over outside. We've had bottles of ammonia it wasn't used but was threatened to get used and chucked into somebody's face, CS gas deployed at a colleague. Knives, no one's been stabbed but they've pulled out knives and threatened them. Dirty needles, again, being used as a threat but not actually being used. But that's just my patch. Some of it's minor, some of it's pretty intense. We had a female that was pregnant, got kicked in the stomach. You know what I mean? And it's awful. It's crazy.
I feel violated every time, and when my colleagues then come and tell me and they've reported things, that it's quite emotional. My colleague turnover is extremely high, not mine but the whole area.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's obvious. Nobody wants to work in an environment where you can't really do your job with excellence, because there are a lot of barriers that shouldn't be there for you to deliver. There was a day I was really in tears because they come in, the whole shelf is empty. I'm calling the police, I'm shaking. It's like, I know it's not my property, and I've been told to just, it's not, psychologically you cannot forget, you cannot pretend it's not happening.
The accounts of verbal abuse were really shocking. So many were very personal. They were remarks about somebody's presumed ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and often were accompanied with threats of violence, sexual violence and physical assault.
It's like some are racist, and then swearing is involved, threatening is involved, all of that, and you just have to silently take it.
With the racial abuse, do you report that? Or that's sort of hate motivated, isn't it?
It's got to the point where it's just we're fed up of doing it.
Yeah.
Because even in a normal crime, they don't do nothing. Even in a spitting incident, they don't do nothing. So what is the point to even doing it as racist?
You get tired, don't you?
You do.
When they come in, they go, I've got a knife, or you don't know what's in my bag. That's the scariest part of it, because then you feel helpless. You can't stop them. You can't protect the stock. You can't do anything. I mean, I've had one man, he was bleeding, and he was going, "You want to stay away from me? You don't know what I've got." And there's blood on the floor, and we've got to clean that up. That's what affects the colleagues.
And protecting your colleagues you're on with as a store manager.
I know.
ultimately, I'm like...
In addition to the abuse was, I know where you live, I'm going to rape your kids, I'm going to rape your wife, you know, so it's and these are the types of threats that they do take seriously, because it does impact when they start talking about the impact and what they're going to do to their families. You know, to that extent, we don't know what background these people have got, what they're capable of, what they're prepared to do. If they're prepared to say it, would they follow up on it? Without doubt, watching the CCTV, this guy would have clear intent to do anything he would get away with.
Given the picture that was being painted by various employees that I spoke to, presumably the police are aware of these issues. Presumably they're out there arresting people, investigating the worst violent offenders and the people who are stealing in bulk and then selling on for profit. So I asked about the police response, and of course there were the expected views that the police don't show up, they're not interested, they don't do enough, they're not arresting people. And that is in itself very concerning. But there were other things that shop staff were telling me that really highlighted what an issue the under-resourcing of the police has become. And some of the behaviours as well that they described simply not being appropriate. Some individuals were being told not to call 999 to the extent that if they did do, it would be them that would receive a warning. The Co-op recently did a Freedom of Information request to police forces in England and Wales, and they found that the police don't attend in over 70% of reports. And bearing in mind, the Co-op only report the most serious or high volume thefts, or those with violence and threats, that really is a worry.
But they send you an email, don't they, that say they don't think it's a serious enough crime?
Yeah,
so what is a serious enough crime?
We've had people in the store, I've had a man trying to rip off a box off the wall, and we've been told, do not phone 999.
By the police?
Yeah.
Yeah. So by the call handler has told you?
No, the police will come.
Okay.
They'll attend because they have to. And I will be told you should not phone 999. If you continue to do so, you'll get a warning.
That's once you've gone through your name, your date of birth, your sexuality.
By the time you got there,
wasting time where they could be there if they've got someone.
But that's if you get through. You could be on hold. You think you're on a hold to, sorry, we're extremely busy, we'll get to you when we can, on 999.
Yeah.
That's really shocking. But
imagine if it was
shocking they're telling you not to use the emergency services when you feel that that's appropriate.
We have a particular prolific shoplifter. We'll call him Mr. Balaclava Man, that's what we affectionately know him as.
Does he wear a balaclava?
He wears sometimes balaclava, depends what the weather's like, sometimes he'll wear like a face mask like we used to wear in the pandemic.
Okay.
And he's violent, he's abusive, the police know his name, he's been in the local papers, and when I've reported it to the police and the other stores in our local area, I get asked by the police, what are you doing about it? And I'm like, what are you doing about it? I'm reporting the crime to you. We've been told that they can't do anything about it unless me personally can detain this man in the store. He's about 6'5". So this man is violent, he's assaulted me, he's assaulted other colleagues in not just my store, in other stores, but the police, what we get back from the police is, what are you doing? So after being assaulted, I was told the police would come and take a statement. They didn't. So I made a complaint to the police about this, and they had 28 days to get back to me. On the 28th day, I had a phone call from whoever was in charge of the local area police, and again he basically said, you need to detain this man. We know his name, we know his number plate. Basically, unless I can detain this 6'5" man, they're not willing to do anything about it.
It's so shocking. I mean, just what other, victim of assault is told, you have to collar the offender and bring them to us, or, hold them there.
So I've got colleagues in my store that are like, what can we do to get him? I'm like, nothing, you're not going to touch him.
It's too
I
dangerous.
walked behind him because someone went, that's a shoplifter. I went, what? Him? At this time, I didn't know who he was. He kicked back behind me and kicked me in the stomach. He didn't look back at who it was. It could have been anybody. Lucky I'm a sturdy gal. But it could have been anybody. I have elderly people shopping in my shop. I have elderly colleagues. It could have been anyone. He didn't care. So our next steps, myself, my area manager and the other local stores, we're going to write to the MP.
Try and get
we've
some
got to do
action.
something about this.
The fear that is being caused by local offenders and the lack of police response is only too real. Convenience stores operate within communities, and it's those same communities where shop staff also live. There was a real palpable fear that offenders would come back and attack staff at a later date if they reported, and the police were not really offering much support to alleviate that concern. I spoke to Annie, it's not her real name, but she told me about a man who'd set fire to the store in which she worked by taking the firelighters and placing them next to the flammable liquids and aerosols that were being sold as part of the summer barbecue stock. Now, she just about managed to get everyone out of the store before the fire really took hold, but the fire brigade arrived and said that she was just moments away from really serious harm. The man was bailed and still comes into her shop every day. She knows at some point she's going to be called upon to give a statement, but she says, quite understandably, that she's simply too scared for her and for her family to give testimony.
Have you ever been sort of fearful about reporting somebody when there's no consequence that they then might come back the next day?
Yeah, of course. And the thing is, I live in this area. I'm a single parent. I've got a 6-year-old, and I moved to this area because I like it. And the last 5 years, and especially the last 2, it's horrendous. There is no, and I think, do I want my son to grow up in this society? And I look at it and I think, wow, should I need to go to Isle of Shepparton, Scotland, somewhere, Wales, just so, it makes me upset. But I think, I don't want him growing up like this. And what if I do see these people, the police officer that took the statement for me from the arsonist,
That's fine. Do you want a break?
No, I'm fine. No. He said to me, and they think it's a joke, he said to me, I said, where does this guy live? And he said, oh, down your street. What number are you? And I was like, what? And he was like, oh yeah, no, he lives down your street. I was like, and I literally thought that, and I've been told otherwise by he's like, no, he doesn't live there. But why would you say it? It's not a joke. It's not fair. Like, what do I do if my 6-year-old, and obviously my son doesn't know anything about it because, it's not right. You just think it's such a shame. And my colleagues, all the team here that live around, we have to see them, and they do worry. Some of them live near these people and think, oh, are they going to give me issues? And what can I say to them? Because I can't keep them safe because there's no response there. And it's heart-wrenching. Like, the police do get the cases I deal with, really frustrated with the CPS and the courts. But it's because there's no room in the jails, and it seems like the court and the judges are just, it's a slap on the wrist. It's a minimal crime. But what they don't realise, it might be minimal, but all the time, all it does is lead to bigger things.
What are the police telling you about the CPS, that they don't think it's past the evidential threshold?
They say there's 9 times out of 10, they say there's not enough evidence when it's black and white. So, for example, the only person they caught in my 9 break-ins with the vodka in hand, he's been bailed, released, and not gone to court, bailed again. He's been bailed 4 times. And I'm like, what is going on? Oh, well, it's still with CPS, or they're trying to work out the evidence. And so, they're not doing things like soccer. They aren't doing it. The police are saying there isn't enough evidence, or the CPS don't want to push it forward.
So we've heard a lot of speculation in the media as to why this shop theft epidemic is occurring, and I started this episode with wanting to refute the simplistic claim that this was purely due to the cost of living crisis. The trends and the data tell a different story. So why is this happening? And I would argue that it's a perfect storm of a criminal justice system in crisis, including a woefully resourced police service, the extensive retraction of social services during austerity, of which we've had over a decade of now, and this has resulted in record levels of homelessness, mental health crises, obviously exacerbated by the pandemic, and drug and alcohol addiction. There's too much to unpick there for this episode, but I do want to talk briefly about the police and specifically about the number of police officers that there are in England and Wales, because this has been hugely contentious and the figures are often disputed. It's no secret in terms of the police that they've been under-resourced and overstretched for several years now. And the Home Secretary tries to reassure us that there's now more police officers than ever before in the history of policing. That's quite a bold statement. However, the recent increase through the Police Uplift programme is actually only broadly equivalent to the number of officers that were lost between 2010 and 2017. But it also doesn't take into account population growth. So per capita, we do continue to have fewer officers. The devil's really in the detail of that particular claim and statistic around policing numbers. But we've also seen a change in the approach to policing. So the decline in neighbourhood policing and a reduction in PCSOs, they've been halved over that same period. So the police obviously are struggling. They do need to have more resource. And I think this has been widely recognised now. But there's a broader issue as well in terms of criminal justice. There's record court backlogs and ineffective sentencing. I looked up the sentences that prolific offenders receive, and the average custodial sentence for a shop theft is now 2 months. And so take into consideration a early guilty plea and then automatic release, you're looking at less than 1 month in prison. Now, some people think that should be enough, and there's an idea that, it's not serious enough to warrant time in custody. But what I would argue is that sending someone to prison for such a short space of time removes anything pro-social and positive that was happening in that person's life. If they had stable accommodation, they've probably lost it. If they had a job, they will have lost it. If they had benefits, they're going to struggle with reactivating those when they come out. The impact that it has on family relationships, particularly children, etc. A short stint in prison can actually do a lot more harm than good. And it also doesn't allow enough time for individuals to access programmes that can begin to tackle the root causes of their offending behaviour, whether that's drugs, mental health, other possible issues. The wait list in prison, as I'm told from offenders, is usually around 10 months to even be considered for one of these programmes. So what's the solution? I think it has to be a more sophisticated criminal justice system that begins to match up interventions and sanctions and punishments with the offender and their characteristics. That's supposed to be what happens, but sadly we know that it doesn't. But we've also got a criminal justice system that has been so undervalued and underfunded for such a long time that it's only through investment that is going to begin to improve. I don't want to throw so many numbers at you, but investment has been cut by 24% in real terms between 2010 and 2019. So it does seem we've got an increase in crime, but yet a reduced capacity to deal with it. And of course, that is going to be felt in every shop on every high street across the country. So I'd like to end this episode with a heartfelt thank you to all of the individuals that so generously gave me their time and allowed me to talk to them about their experiences of working in shops up and down the country. And so a huge thank you to the Co-op for helping to facilitate these interviews. There will be a full report that's written on the interviews and the focus groups. I spoke to more than 50 people as part of this project, so please do look out for the release of that report.